Yes, my co-presenter, as you can see, is not here. Brian couldn't get across the Tasman, so he sends his apologies. He's Air Force and was caught up by bureaucracy. So it doesn't affect it too much. We had agreed when we wrote this that I would do the main presentation because I'm the better looking, and he's the brains of the outfit, so he would do the question time. So we'll be a little challenged in the second half. As you can see, we're taking you across for Tasman, and I was sitting up the back smiling at how much writing is coming out of the Royal Australian Air Force, because in the RNZAF there's very little. I can only think of one article by an RNZAF officer in the last 5 years. So what Brian, who is with the Air Power Development Centre, and I'm at Massey University, and we have a defence and security program and also a school of aviation, and yet between the two we really haven't been looking at air power in the New Zealand context. So Brian and I have formed up, I guess you could say, to try to start changing that. This is our second small collaboration, and we hope there's more to come. The Air Power Development Centre's small over there. It has 2 staff, so it's been in something of a holding pattern. It's about to expand substantially with its 3rd staff member. And so by linking up with a university, that we're really hopeful that we can start to change things. This is my only slide, by the way. When we think about New Zealand, and I'm Australian, so when I went over there, I would have 9 years ago said that all of the green you can see is on the left is where Kiwi men and sheep interact. That was my knowledge of New Zealand. I'd still like to say that if there was a colleague here, but when we think about New Zealand, we tend to think about the 2 islands, North and the South Island. There is an equivalent of Tasmania, which is Stewart Island, right down on the bottom of the South Island. It's always forgotten. But in terms of air power, New Zealand is something it's not just the land that we have to think about. Since the 1990s, New Zealand has declared its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And that doesn't just take in the mainland, the 2 islands. What you see on the left is the extent of that exclusive economic zone, because it takes in a fair number of islands, and that means for the RNZAF, and particularly in relation to the Orions, which is one of the things we'll be talking about today, this is quite an extensive area. And then we see the map on the right, and that's what you can see around New Zealand is the outline of the search and rescue. It's international, it's responsible for that area, international search and rescue operations, and it's quite extensive. And also, of course, New Zealand has a strong presence in the South Pacific. So when we talk about the use of particularly its long-range aircraft, it's quite an extensive area that the Royal New Zealand Air Force operates into on a weekly basis. So that's what we'll be talking about today, is primarily the long-range strategic aircraft. And it's also a period that there is going to be some very substantial change over the next decade. So this is a partner for Australia in the South Pacific, and it's one that some members of the RAAF who have served or have flown alongside New Zealanders would think about the RNZAF operating old aircraft, because it tends to do so. But in the next 5 to 10 years, virtually all of its main aircraft need to be replaced. So that's going to be quite a challenging period for the RNZAF, and that's where I'm taking us today. Being still quite new to air power, I'm going to be quite reliant on the written word from this point onwards, and I will try to keep an eye on the time as well. So I'm going to first explain New Zealand, the NZDF and the RNZAF. It's not as well known as perhaps we might think it is. We're then going to talk about some of the changes in terms of the main equipment and lead us into what are the possibilities in terms of maritime patrol aircraft and transport aircraft. So New Zealand, it's a small country, 4.5 or actually 4.7 now million people, but it's also one of Australia's main partners in regional defence, particularly of course with the South Pacific. Both countries acknowledge each other in their defence white papers, but it's a bit like your younger cousin following you around. New Zealand does it in a much stronger way in its defence white paper with a very clear statement. Australia is New Zealand's most important bilateral partner. New Zealand has no better friend and no closer ally. Through its size, location and strategic reach, Australia contributes significantly to New Zealand's security. New Zealand needs this relationship. The New Zealand Defence Force is quite modest in size, 11,440 or so regulars and 2,300 reservists. That's about 1/6 of the strength of the ADF. The other problem for the NZDF has been funding for many years. Australia's military expenditure as a percentage of GDP has fallen slightly over the last 20 years, ups and downs. But for New Zealand, it's been a long and quite disheartening decline from 2.1% of GDP in 1988 to 1.2% of GDP in 2015. And given it's a small country, the NZDF traditionally doesn't have a lot of money to play with. The 2016-17 defence budget is equivalent to 2.05 billion Australian dollars. 500 million of that is acquisition costs, the rest are operating funds. So like Australia, where it's similar, New Zealand strives to contribute internationally and it belongs to a series of defence, security and intelligence partnerships. It's a Five Eyes partner. That's an important one for New Zealand. It partners with NATO under the Individual Partnership Cooperation Program. It's committed to the principle of interoperability. That's, I don't know the Navy's approach to it, but it has membership of ABCA armies and also the Air and Space Interoperability Council. It regularly contributes to coalition operations, including in the Middle East and anti-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa. It's a regular contributor to UN peace support operations. For many years, New Zealanders saw that that was the primary role of the NZDF. And a big change in recent years is that once again, New Zealand and the United States are on friendly terms. I think it was the Wellington Declaration in 2010 formally ended the dispute over ANZUS. So air power. The Royal New Zealand Air Force is 1/6 the strength of the RAF, 2,400 regulars, 200 reservists and 280 civilians. Having lost its strike squadrons in the early, or its strike squadron in the early 2000s, things like that are just a dream for most, for all, except if you're on exchange, RNZAF personnel. Since the early 2000s, the RNZAF has been essentially a transport and maritime patrol arm of the New Zealand Defence Force. They're both important roles for particularly a maritime nation, and it reflects in the fleet, I guess, of the Air Force. It's a fleet of just 50 aircraft. When I got there in 2007, you could still hear bells soothe, waka waka flying around the area. It's a country that tends to hold on to its aircraft for quite some time. But at present, 6 P3 Orions, 5 C-130H Hercules, 2 757s, 9 NH-90 helicopters, 8 Super Sea Sprites, most of those acquired from Australia in recent years, of course. 4 Super King Airs, used mostly for training and some VIP transport. The most recent aircraft are 11 T-6 Texan II trainers, and there are 5 Augusta Westland A109 light utility helicopters, mostly used for training. New Zealand's Defence White Paper 2016 emphasises that investment in current and future military capabilities is heavily influenced by New Zealand's strategic circumstances and its understanding of how these are likely to evolve over the coming decades. Now, like Australia, New Zealand perceives that the nature of conflict is changing, that terrorism will be an enduring threat, or at least for many years to come. But Asia's economic and military importance is on the rise. But there will be, and this is an important one for New Zealand, increased resource competition as a consequence of globalisation and global warming. Much of what New Zealand is concerned about, what you see in the white paper, is an understanding that they have resources and those resources may be wanted in the future. It's not so much that there's a direct military threat envisaged, but more a lot of poaching activities, but also movement into the South Pacific, into island nations, and having to also help safeguard their resources. So that's what New Zealand is seeing as the challenge. And in addition, New Zealand is increasingly concerned that Antarctica is becoming an issue. So they're the threats, and that's what's going to shape acquisition of new aircraft in the future. So the aircraft. Sorry, I get hit by hay fever every time I come back to Canberra. The New Zealand Defence Force has 3 aircraft types that it considers to be strategic assets or contributing to long-range operations. That's the 2 757s, the 5 C-130H Hercules and the 6 P-3 Orions. They each contribute to capability, but also currently they are all contributing to a major procurement challenge that's now started. The C-130Hs and 757s need to be replaced in the early 2020s. By then, the Hercules will be 50 years old. The 757s have just passed the quarter-century mark. And the Orions need to be replaced in the mid-2020s. On top of this, New Zealand needs to acquire 2 Anzac frigates. So New Zealanders, but more importantly the New Zealand government, is facing up to the fact that they're about to encounter a very expensive few years, which is quite a problem, or was quite a problem for many years, because the New Zealand Defence Force is not well supported by the public. That reflects that it was for a long time not well supported by government, but there are signs of change there. In the previous Defence White Paper in 2010, the government stated that it intended to set out a pathway to retain and enhance existing NZDF capabilities. Retain and enhance are 2 very important words. In a sense, this was a statement that the long decline, the lack of support was coming to an end. The New Zealand Defence Force responded by developing a 3-phase plan, Force 35, to develop by 2015 a joint amphibious task force that's still not quite there, not all that well supported. By 2020, an enhanced combat capability that would include increased whole-of-government support for security operations, increased emphasis on C4ISR, increased engagement and security cooperation in the Southwest Pacific, and improved maritime combat capability. And by 2035, what it terms an integrated defence force, emphasising in particular amphibious capability, particularly to provide reach up into the South Pacific, improved C4ISR, and, important for air power, air transport and air surveillance capabilities like they haven't quite had before. There was a further milestone, and this is not often noticed in New Zealand, and that was a 2013 Cabinet-ordered Defence Midpoint Rebalancing Review, as it was called. And this set out 6 possible funding tracks to achieve what had been set out in the Defence White Paper of 2010. Track 1 was the most expensive, and it went down to Track 6, which was the least expensive. The bottom 4 of those, and to an extent the bottom 5, would all have required New Zealand to start leaning rather more heavily on its friend and ally, Australia. And there were messages that this wouldn't necessarily be welcomed by that friend and ally. And importantly, Cabinet agreed to support Track 1, stating that only Track 1 would enable realisation of a policy outlined in the Defence White Paper. What's important about Track 1 is, while it didn't state it emphatically, it means that the replacement of the Hercules and the Orions in particular basically were receiving the go-ahead to go ahead with planning. They do still have to find the money, but there's a commitment there to take it seriously and to try not to. Well, it's reached a point where they can't actually extend the life of the aircraft. So take it seriously and start looking hard at what can they get to replace the Hercules and the Orions. Just going to talk about maritime surveillance first, and then the transport aircraft. So the backbone of the NZDF's airborne maritime reconnaissance and surveillance capability for the last half century has been the Orion. The 6 airframes, 5 acquired originally and 1 acquired in about 1985 from Australia, retain their original identities. All of them were P3B model Orions to begin with, but significant upgrades have extended their lifespan. The most recent has seen the aircraft upgraded to what they call the P3K2 standard, and that involved a redesigned flight control, data management, sensor communications and navigation systems that earlier received new wings and whatnot, so that they could remain in service until around 2025. Experience with the Orion shows how New Zealand perceives air power and its strategic air assets a little differently to Australia. When introduced, the Orion was perceived and utilised as an Air Force asset. But at the end of the 1990s, the RNZAF requested funding to update the Orion's avionics. The Clark government, which at the time was not really pro-defence, this was before 9/11, instead of considering the avionics issue, ordered a review of a maritime patrol capability. Now, New Zealand has the challenge of everything small. It's got a small customs service, it's got a small police service, it's got a small defence force. And the Clark government was sending out a clear message that all of those agencies need to start working together to produce a more cost-effective national security system. And the Orion fleet was of particular interest because at the time it was tended to be just, I'll give the Clark government's view, I'll make this up a little bit, twaddling around the Pacific, a bit of a flying club for the Air Force, and not really much use to the rest of the nation. That's how it was perceived. At the time, the Orion fleet cost $105 million a year to operate, and it was flying on average 5% of a year, each aircraft. So a review was ordered, and this was undertaken by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. They looked at the Orions and decided that they weren't terribly useful, making the point that in the previous 35 years, the RNZAF had not operated them ever on a military operation outside of New Zealand waters. They'd never seen combat, they'd never contributed to peacekeeping. And the reviewers concluded that it was hard to justify retention of the military capability in the Orions. So the Orions were stripped of much of their, some of their military capability. Anti-submarine warfare, for example, was considered a waste of time, and the government set up a coordination body so that the Orions would essentially become more a service, more an aircraft that would serve the other agencies, customs police and fisheries in particular. And that really drove the use of the Orions over the next decade. There was, however, a change. In 2003, a detachment was sent to the Middle East to contribute to Operation Enduring Freedom. And the Air Force was able to say, hey, we still have a military responsibility here. But for the most part, the Orions have been seen as a civilian, contributing to civilian national security. In recent years, and I'll just skip over the remainder of it, very recently, the government, having realised that the security situation is changing, has started to look more seriously at the military capability side of the Orions, and have recently signed a contract to restore the anti-submarine warfare capability, for example. What this means, it's very good timing, because with replacement on the horizon, the RNZAF can expect that that capability will also be built into the acquisition of new aircraft. It's still early days. They don't know what they're going to end up with. The suggestions are perhaps a mix of unmanned and manned aircraft along the lines of those acquired by Australia, but there's also some public dispute that this may be rather costly. The government is also coming up to an election in a couple of years, so we don't know what the change will be. The same with the 757s. I'll just very quickly mention them. 757s and Hercules, both in need of replacement. Last year, the New Zealand government seriously considered buying 2 C-17s. And while they had given the go-ahead to spend the money, they weren't yet ready to do so. There was only 10 C-17s available at the time. By the time New Zealand got around to seriously considering it, 9 of those had been sold, so there was 1 left. And there was a recognition that this aircraft can do something that the current fleet could not do. That was get to Antarctica, which is becoming much more important, carry the NH-90s up to the islands in case they need to be deployed there, carry LAVs up to the islands. So it's a real capability that just does not exist at present, but they weren't ready to spend the money. So it suggests that while the statements have been made that the RNZAF will get the support, there's going to be still something of a battle to acquire the aircraft that are needed. In terms of what the future capability is, and I'll just finish here, it really is that map on the right. The New Zealand government has determined that it really needs to focus on the South Pacific. It needs to be there particularly to take up the slack if Australia cannot focus on the South Pacific. That occurred in the late 2000s when Orion flights over that area were reduced. So you will see aircraft acquired that really can focus on this area whilst still being able to contribute to international operations further afield. I think that's about the time. So.
Strategic imagination. Why not abolish the NZAF and just create an ANZAC squadron of the RAF and just give it to the RAF to do? Just get rid of it. It's too small, it's not viable, and just get New Zealand to pay Australia a premium to provide for its needs. Is that strategic or creative?
Funny, one of the things. Funny you should say that. One of the suggestions we're making in our first piece, and Brian asked me to emphasise that he's writing as an individual, not as a member of the government at this or the Air Force at this point, is either doing that or basing the aircraft in Australia where at least the RNZAF could access the Australian maintenance facilities, and just having detached flights operating out of New Zealand. Not sure it's ever going to happen, but...
I can just imagine the plane straight off the top. Peter.
Yes, look, I found that fascinating. And the thought came to my mind, would there be a country in the world with fewer identifiable threats than New Zealand? I can see why you need surveillance of the South Pacific and the capability for police operations in the islands, but the islands are never going to be a threat. Is there a nation in the world with fewer identifiable threats?
I'm looking madly at the map trying to spot one. I guess New Zealand doesn't see it that way. There's certainly, go back to 1942, they had a big fear about Japan, but they knew that they were safe from invasion. New Zealand doesn't see itself as directly threatened in that sense, but what it sees itself as is both contributing to international security. So it's very, very committed to that in terms of it wants to be able to contribute in a small way, but also it's the interests in the region. There's mounting concern that the Antarctic Treaty will collapse, and New Zealand's playing a game at the moment of saying, oh, we're concerned about Antarctica, but you can't help thinking, no, they also want a stake in Antarctica should the treaty collapse. So there's a desire to protect its resource interests. It sees around within the exclusive economic zone as being directly threatened. There's a lot of fishing, illegal fishing going on. There's a fear of increased trafficking of particularly drugs and also potentially people. The Air Force plays a role in each of those, sometimes not terribly effectively. Customs, for example, needs support over summer. That's when most of the small boat arrivals arrive. The Air Force offers most of its support to customs in winter, when fisheries are very happy, but customs sees no value in it. So that's gone a little off track. But it does see threats. It just doesn't see a direct invasion.
Travis, thank
you. Interestingly enough, my first exposure to the politics of air power was from the Royal New Zealand Air Force when Helen Clark was in Melbourne. I think a domestic dispute meant that she couldn't get out, so a P3K had to come to East Sale where I was doing nav course and actually extricate her from there. And it was an interesting insight because the P3 crew had some time to discuss P3 operations. But it's an interesting, what I find about the RNZAF is the technological innovation that the Kiwis have in terms of innovative solutions on how they can actually employ their aircraft better is just phenomenal. Some of the stuff that I've heard, their equivalent of DSTG, the Science Technology Group, is phenomenal. But it would seem that the academic side, the policy side, the strategic side is where they're actually lacking, and having two people in their equivalent, the Air Power Development Centre, would seem to be a problem. Does the NZDF see that intellectual issue as a problem in terms of their facing, or do they just basically present themselves as an ad hoc response to whatever government needs?
It's in the process of changing. When I first got there, I was teaching into the Command and Staff College, and there was very little interest in the academic side. Over the last 5 years, the NZDF has slowly, and it realises it has to do this slowly, trying to introduce some more intellectual thought. The Army, for example, has recently launched an Army journal. There have been a couple of attempts to get an NZDF journal off the ground. I'm not aware of an air power journal, but small steps. The Air Power Development Centre's looked at the Australian model and has adopted a couple of their publication streams, but their struggle is to get people to write for it as well. So it's there. And you do, of course, also have officers who have come back from overseas staff colleges as well. So there's exposure to it internationally, but it is just a bit of a struggle. It's probably a mass thing as much as anything else.
That was my question. Is there a critical mass enough? When you need two people for a conversation.
Yeah.
So is there not enough people like you, like-minded people, like these guys that want to get in, throw ideas around? And if so, where's the venue for that to happen?
Yeah, I think that's probably the problem. I mean, a decade ago, the Air Power Development Centre at Ohakia was about 9 or 10 people strong. They lost their CO, and then who was very much an intellectual, and it seemed to go down from there. So sometimes it comes down to the individual, and it suggests that there's not that many individuals who are supporting those initiatives.
Just one last question before we finish.
As you start to look at, Marshal, Air Force, ADFTA, as you start looking at your future acquisitions, where do you see your key interoperability concerns? Where are you going to operate? Who are you going to operate with? I mean, traditionally we've gone Western, US, but we're seeing, certainly from our perspective, when we operate with NATO, our interoperability is basically set up from a US side. So from your standards side of the house, we don't align. And when you go and talk to NATO forces, they go, oh, well, we have to just play with the Americans the way the Americans play, which creates enhanced workloads on the operators in theatre, for example. Where do you see your platforms coming from in the future?
I think reading the government documents in NZDF, it's Australia. One of the attractions of the C-17, the RNZAF was really keen on it, was it's operated by Australia. But one of the challenges for the maritime side is New Zealand doesn't necessarily have the budget for P8s, for example. So there may have to be different aircraft, but there is a very much a commitment to be able to operate alongside the Australians. It's in right through the documentation. That's where New Zealand sees its closest partnership. And as to what they end up with, though, I'm not sure. But the systems, I guess, will be more important than the platform in that sense.
Please join with me.